The story of the Ashland Vikings begins in 1963, set against the backdrop of a bustling yet turbulent Chicago. This was a time of significant change for the city, and particularly for neighborhoods like East Village and Noble Square. These communities had recently started seeing a wave of Puerto Rican migration, a movement that quickly began reshaping the demographics, culture, and social dynamics of the area. Many new arrivals were looking for a fresh start, but the challenges they faced were immense. Poverty, language barriers, and racial divides created a volatile environment, where tensions simmered just beneath the surface. For the youth of these neighborhoods, this was a defining period, one marked by the search for identity, community, and belonging. Chicago's streets were beginning to witness the rise of street gangs, groups formed in response to these social and economic pressures. However, the story of the Ashland Vikings didn't start with gang violence. In fact, it started with something much more innocent, a simple game of football. A group of young boys, barely in their teens, gathered to play football on the grounds of Wells High School, located at the intersection of Ashland Avenue and Walton Street. They played together regularly, forming close bonds through their shared love of the game. This wasn't about gangs, crime, or territory, it was about friendship and the joy of sport. For 2 years, this group remained nameless, just a group of kids enjoying their time on the field, unworried about the trouble brewing in other parts of the city. However, as the group became more organized, the boys realized they needed an official name for their football team. A vote was held in 1965, and the name Ashland Vikings was chosen, narrowly beating out the alternative option, Ashland Pirates. The choice of the name Vikings was significant. It symbolized strength, unity, and a warrior spirit that would eventually define the group's future. While at the time it was just about football, the name Vikings would come to mean something much more intense and consequential in the years to follow. By 1967, the social climate in East Village and Noble Square had started to change dramatically. The once peaceful streets became a battleground, as prominent street gangs like the Latin Kings began to assert their control over areas like Ashland Avenue. For the Vikings, who had no affiliation with these gangs, this was a troubling development. They weren't a gang, they were just kids playing football and hanging out. But in this changing environment, that was enough to make them a target. The Vikings soon found themselves caught in the crossfire between the Latin Kings and another rival gang, the Playboys. Neither of these established gangs took kindly to the presence of an organized group of young boys who weren't aligned with any faction. For the Vikings, things quickly went from bad to worse. They were harassed on the streets, targeted for fights, and constantly forced to flee from confrontations they never wanted. At first, the Vikings had no way to defend themselves. They were outnumbered and outmatched by the more established gangs. But the constant harassment took its toll, and a tipping point was reached. In 1967, a 13-year-old boy named Puncher, who had become a respected figure within the group, made a bold decision. Tired of being bullied, Puncher decided that it was time for the Ashland Vikings to become something more than just a football team. They would form their own street gang for protection and to assert themselves against the larger, more established gangs that terrorized their community. From that moment, the Vikings became a force to be reckoned with. Their territory extended from Walton to Fry Street and from Ashland to Greenview Street and Noble Square. The Vikings, though small in number, were resourceful and innovative. They created their own weapons, including Molotov cocktails and homemade shotguns, and adopted tactics that helped them gain an edge over their rivals. Although many of the Vikings were Puerto Rican, they also welcomed members from other ethnic backgrounds, including 3 white members, showcasing a level of inclusivity not often seen in other gangs at the time. As the 1960s came to an end, the Ashland Vikings continued to grow in both numbers and influence. By 1968, they had earned a reputation for their resilience and street smarts, particularly in their battles with the Latin Kings. The Vikings' light green sweaters, initially a simple uniform for their football team, had become a symbol of their unity and power. But by 1969, the Vikings began to evolve even further, adopting new colors, green and black, that signified their transformation from a football team into a full-fledged street organization. During this time, the Vikings also began to forge alliances with other gangs that shared a common enemy in the Latin Kings. One of their most important alliances was with the Harrison Gents, a gang operating out of Beach and Ashland in Wicker Park. Together, the two gangs worked systematically to push the Latin Kings out of their neighborhoods, solidifying their control over the West Town area. In 1970, Puncher made a strategic move by relocating the gang's clubhouse to a more secure location, an attic in an 8-unit building at 845 N Ashland. This new clubhouse served as the nerve center of the Vikings' operations. It wasn't just a place to hang out, it was where they conducted gang business, planned operations, and strengthened their hold over Noble Square. As the Vikings grew in power, they also began absorbing members from other gangs, including former members of the Latin Kings, Warlords, and Harrison Gents. In 1973, however, the Vikings faced a significant setback that would mark a turning point in their history. Some of their members were implicated in the Belmont Harbor murders, a robbery gone wrong that resulted in the brutal deaths of 2 women. This event brought intense law enforcement scrutiny down on the Vikings, leading to the arrest of many key members. The gang's businesses collapsed, and others fled the city, some even returning to Puerto Rico. For a time, it seemed as though the Ashland Vikings were finished, a fading chapter in Chicago's gang history. But the Vikings were nothing if not resilient. By 1976, Puncher had regrouped and revitalized the organization with the creation of a new section called the Sons, led by a promising young recruit known as Young Blood. This move marked the beginning of the 8-Point Register, a system of 8 individual sections, each with its own leadership but all united under the Viking banner. The story of the Ashland Vikings is one of transformation, from a group of young boys playing football in the streets of Chicago to a feared and powerful street gang. Their rise and fall reflect the complex social dynamics of Chicago during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. In their search for identity, power, and a sense of belonging, the Vikings left an indelible mark on the city's history. Though their time in the spotlight was relatively short, their legacy lives on in the memories of those who were part of it, as well as in the communities that they once called home.